This is part 2 of a 3-part podcast with Andre Feldman.
Hi, welcome to the Pnoe podcast series. I am Daniel Crumbach, the head of science and education at Pnoe. I'm a clinical exercise physiologist, sport physiotherapist, high performance specialist, and strength conditioning coach with over 25 years of experience in performance and health optimization. I specialize in physiological testing, analysis, and exercise program design, working with a large spectrum of the population, from the general public seeking to improve their health and function, to amateur and professional and Olympic athletes who want to improve their performance. Throughout my career, I've worked with amateur to elite triathletes and endurance athletes, bodybuilders, military and other tactical professionals, as well as many national and Olympic teams in China. At Pnoe, our mission is to bridge the gap between science and Eurofitness. Through Pnoe, the world's first clinical-grade cardiometabolic analyzer for the mass market, we gave everyday consumers access to the biometric monitoring and guidance once only available to Olympians. Our clients range from wellness and weight loss coaches to world-renowned triathletes, leading academic institutions, and healthcare systems. What they all share in common is the dedication to the belief that science-based decisions hold the key to any fitness and health goal. Throughout our journey that started from research in nanosensing technologies and evolved to helping people improve their performance and health, we saw that science and fitness have drifted apart. We launched this podcast to change that. Here, we bring cutting-edge insights from athletes, coaches, scientists, and industry leaders who share their knowledge and experience of how science-based decisions lead to success.
And the longer you hang on to your athlete and the more accurate your training programs are, it seems like the longer period of time you can go between retests because you're addressing the variables that need to be addressed. And so at first I found that, people were concerned about the frequency of the retest and because of cost or inconvenience. But the fact was that, I would rather retest 4 to 6 weeks later after the first one and addressing the new programming, and then 8 to 12 weeks after that for several tests in a row. But meanwhile, I was also doing performance testing on at least a 4-week basis to be able to look at changes in performance related to some metric.
Yeah, what I think I've mentioned this with you before in other conversations, because I agree, is that I think sometimes, like, if I talk to classical kind of endurance coaches, I feel they should almost adopt a little bit more of a strength and conditioning coach mentality using the tech. I mean, a lot of strength conditioning coaching stuff, it's very much it's much more performance and physiology based, but track your performance improvements. And if you're not getting any more, well, you switch your program up. And you can very much consider that with like your testing. You got to do your testing. And if you're getting the improvements that you want in the physiology that you expect, then maybe you continue that plan. If you're not getting it, well, then you got to train. You got to somehow either say, well, I need more time. You could make that argument, or you got to change up your training plan. And
absolutely.
If you close those testing iterations, you're more agile.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's some people are using, especially cyclists, are using a functional test like FTP to be able to identify limitations which they're not measuring and design training programs. It would be the same as using VO2 max for multiplying by percentages to make a training program. It doesn't make any sense because you have a single number you're multiplying it by, which is math, instead of actually looking at trends over time during the testing and also the effects of the training program.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. So I like FTP and I like things like the critical power model. I think there's usefulness there, especially I think they have quite a high predictive component to predicting how well someone will perform. But what they lack is, for example, training planning components. They can tell you something about performance readiness, in my opinion, but why that performance is there and why it's not higher or why it's not lower, the whole system falls apart. And since testing has to do with training planning, training guiding, less than performance. Performance, you got to race. If you win, you win. It doesn't matter what your test performance was. It's more about training planning. And so that's where the FTP, in my opinion, is weak. It doesn't really offer that. It just gives you a predictive power of what your performance is in a range. It's in this range, your performance. You don't know why. So,
right.
Yeah.
And if you can't isolate the limitation, and that's one issue, but actually doing math on it to determine intensity zones is it's just a misuse of that test. It should strictly tell you, your power output for a predicted 1 hour intensity, and then that's what it's supposed to be. And what's really funny, if you talk to people about their FTP, and it's one of the favorite questions I have when a cyclist comes in. So what's your FTP? And they said, well, 280 watts. I said, great. I'm going to set the bike for 280 watts and let you ride for an hour. And they say, well, I can't do that. And you're going, well, it's kind of the definition of it. So maybe it's wrong. And then by multiplying it by percentages. But as far as a performance test to look at output, I think it's great. And every sport needs it, whether, critical power, like you said, or along the running side, that ability to look at your running performance on a regular basis. I used to do P lines, in which all I did was I challenged them to run at the speeds that I identified during their VO2 and NIRS test. And then every month they would send me a P line with the heart rates at those speeds to be able to determine if there was a change in their performance over time. And if you track it properly, you could actually see, for example, if I was working at establishing their base, you could see the bottom of their performance at the lower intensities would improve significantly, and the top end would just maintain. And it shows that your application of the training program is actually improving what it should.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, you kind of hit a major point there that I always try to tell, especially more physiology-based coaches, which I'm for, is to not lose sight of the performance aspect. I think in the end, the goal is increased performance. So you should somehow track performance and make sure that if you're getting physiological changes that you might expect and that you would characterize as positive, let's say, that better show up with some improvements in performance. If it doesn't, you could make an argument for health, which is nice, but it wasn't really the goal. So you somehow you need to document that you're improving the athlete as well.
I agree. Well, we've worked a lot together with testing and data analysis with NIRS and VO2, but I've been working a long time with SpiroTagger, and obviously the new SpiroTagger P100 is coming out soon from IDIAG. I'm very excited about it. It adds a lot of interesting components to it, like the ability to have a CO2 monitor on it and be able to ensure that pH balance is maintained, CO2, O2 levels are maintained so that you can train for extended periods of time. Control over volumes, control over breathing frequencies, the ability to do both volume and as well as work on breathing frequencies themselves, as well as resistance for those that require strength training. It's at a very exciting time. A lot of people don't realize that the respiratory system can have profound effects on other systems like the cardiovascular metabolic systems. I'd really appreciate it if you could explain to our audience what some of those other ramifications are when you have a respiratory limitation.
So first, I think again, disclosure, I work for EDIAC, as you already mentioned. So, but to do some corporatism here, we're very excited about the P100. So I work directly in the product development of the device, and I think it is going to be really cool. It's going to do really strength resistance training and this kind of endurance respiratory training. The testing has been a lot of fun. So I think it's going to be a really cool tool. I worked with the SpiroTagger for many years even before I started working for EDIAC. Used it with athletes, and generally have had pretty good success with the tool. So like you, I'm definitely a big fan. But the respiratory limitations. So maybe a funny anecdote. I remember like at first university, I already knew the SpiroTagger because my dad, and I was talking to a prof of mine at the University of British Columbia about respiratory limitations, and he's like, they don't exist. And then I was like, why? Like, why do you think that they don't exist? And the knockdown argument that he gave me was, if you do a maximum minute ventilation test you're going to have way more ventilation than what you do at the end of a VO2 max test. Therefore, your capacity for ventilation is way higher, and therefore it's not limited. And this is a mind-blowingly stupid argument. Apologize. I'm not mentioning names, so no one knows. In that no one would say that for running speed. If I can run 100 meters in, my 12 seconds or whatever I'm running it in, I don't assume I'm going to run my 400 meter in 48 seconds and say, well, why can't I? I know that I can run 100 meters in 12. There's obviously other components than testing something at a maximum capacity and then looking at what it's like during a different. So it's a ludicrous argument. And then it comes to it, mid ventilation tests are done in 12 seconds and usually times 4 or whatever, times 5, which is then the FDP problem again. Right? Yeah. No one can you even do it for a minute.
This is still written in exercise physiology books to this day.
Yeah. It's so. I mean, that argument is ludicrous. Now there's good data that shows respiratory system can limit performance in various ways. I mean, you know all this literature with the metabolic reflex and Dempsey, and in Switzerland there's Putelia and Spengler that look at all this, which work with EDIAC together a lot on this respiratory training device. There is some discussion around how effective respiratory training is. We're kind of segueing into something a little bit different here. I don't know if you can pull me back if we're going to talk about respiratory limitations.
Oh, absolutely. This is a great topic. I just presented a webinar in my series on respiratory testing and limitations and respiratory training. It gets a lot of people excited because people have never considered that number one, it could be a limitation. Number two, it's trainable. And number three, through training can improve performance. So all these aspects are extremely exciting.
Yeah. So to kind of maybe dodge a little bit your question about the respiratory limitation, but I'm just going to put it out that there's good data and reasoning why your respiratory muscles can limit performance. And there's a lot of research out there. We could talk about that another time. But one of the bigger, more controversial is, well, can you train that system in the way that we're proposing that you can train it using some kind of respiratory tool? And the reason that this question is controversial is because there seems to be a pretty solid amount of responders and non-responders. So there's like all of these Spengler-Putelia papers that show respiratory training improves performance, which is great, looks good. But then there's also other papers. One on top of my head, I know the University of Houston is one on the top of my head, that 2013 maybe. I'd have to take a look if someone really wants to know. I can find it in my Mendeley. And there they had, interesting is they showed increases in ventilation and tidal volume and all those classical things. Well, they're ventilating better. But for example, they didn't show an increase in VO2. Right. And so you get these weird effects that people have very different responses to this. And so that creates, in an empirical data collection, if you don't kind of sort out how you're going to do your data collection, it just creates this responders, non-responders, non-significant changes with huge variation. And this is exactly where what you do comes in that, well, maybe it's just not good for everyone. I mean, in most training modules, if you do anything, it helps. The more trained people get, the more focused you need to train. You get a lot of non-responders in a whole bunch of different types of training things, depending on the level. And so you need to be a little bit more clear. And this is, where we get to expertise on what you're doing, like gathering this information to identify what could be a respiration limitation.
Well, what's interesting is most of the research is on inspiratory. But I know, and I'm sure you've seen exactly the same thing, a large number of high performance athletes are limited by their ability to expire, not inspire. So, I think why the research isn't there? And then, of course, most of the devices out there for respiratory training are resistive devices for inspiration. Whereas, if we look at FVC and FEV1, so the ability to forcefully expire in 1 second, how it relates to high intensity breathing, when you're breathing at 45 to 55 breaths a minute, your volume you can move in 1 second is extremely important.
Yeah. So I agree. I think the reason for the inspiration expiration, why the research is like that, may generally be because inspiration is the active part of the diaphragm, right? It contracts and it does like this, and then your lungs open. And expiration would then actually be passive. You just, your muscle relaxes and it creates a volume pressure change and you exhale. Now, that's nice that it's like that when you're in a passive situation. But as we all know, the more active you start moving, you actually have to help with that pressure change. And I think you're right, is that you actually get in my opinion, with a lot of people get a coordination problem, that they start like breathing in and not really breathing out enough. Yep. And it throws, especially at different situations, people with different running speeds sometimes too, because they start running at a different cadence than they're used to, which messes up your breathing. And so you kind of get this weird breathing flow thing going on, which would be why you're tracking this ventilation data and be like, well, what's going on? Tidal volume just went to crap here. And you need to figure out why that's happening. So that's from my experience. I don't know what you see. I think we've talked about these things before.
Absolutely. I mean, that's this is the value. I see so many times people with equipment for doing VO2 testing, never doing a spirometry. And yet, if you don't test the lung volumes, how do you know how well they're using their capacity during exercise? So
yeah. I mean, it's such an easy thing to test, right? It's so easy to figure out, well, at least it looks like if you do one forced breath, you have 5 liters and you're constantly doing 1 liter breaths to maximum intensity in your VO2 test. Maybe not optimal.
Agreed. Yeah. It's a whole different way of looking at things. I'm certainly promoting anybody who's doing VO2 to have a spirometer. It takes 5 minutes before the test. They're relatively cheap, and you don't have to buy anything expensive. As long as it's accurate and easy to use, it's a great way of being able to look at your VO2 data, like your breathing frequencies and tidal volumes, and be able to determine if they have good capacity, how well are they able to use it. Otherwise, if you're just looking at your VT, you have no idea how it relates to their capacity in the first place. So you're missing a large part of the respiratory analysis that you can do.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you don't have to set any of these things as some kind of pedestal gold standard, but just having that information and using it to make decisions is important.
Well, I gotta drag you back to another question that I asked before, but in your simplest way possible for our audience, what are the effects of respiratory limitations on the cardiovascular and metabolic system?
Yeah, so the simplest way is if you, again, because I do NIRS research, and NIRS measures oxygen supply and demand in the muscle, and so the supply side of that comes from your cardiopulmonary system, and if you're not able to uptake oxygen enough, you're going to have a problem loading that oxygen onto your blood and then sending it to your muscles to be used. So you get this supply and demand balance problem. So I mean, that's the simplest way. And obviously this is more complicated. Maybe something to consider when looking at things like, well, can respiration be a limitation and what are the effects of it, is I like to go then to like extreme examples, because there I should find problems. Now, you're going to have some confounding factors, but like COPD patients, they clearly have some issue with the respiratory system, where I'm going to I have a high predictability of saying, well, it's somehow linked to the respiratory system. And what you see with COPD or like asthma is that you have this much quicker drop, an earlier drop in muscle oxygenation. And they all have they all have performance limitations. VO2 is lower. And since VO2 is this oxygen supply and demand parameter, if you're seeing this clear, strong use of oxygen in the muscle, but getting down to very low percentages of oxygen still available much earlier in people with these respiratory problems, I deduce out of that, well, if they could uptake more oxygen, then they would have more in their muscles. Oversimplified. And I hope that train of thought can be tracked as to why, using these extreme examples and how respiratory limitations kind of manifest themselves. Now, there's a whole bunch of other problems that can. So like COPD extreme examples are you can have issues with like antioxidant issues. You can have cardiovascular problems, like all these other effects. You already have a fact that COPD and cardiovascular disease are correlated because the people who have them tend to be unhealthy. So it becomes a weird kind of correlation, not causation thing. Maybe on a little bit of clearer note, not to go too wonky here, a lot of people understand this is there is a link between your respiration and your cardio and your heart function directly, or it's proposed, and that's the thoracic pump effect. So the idea is that when you breathe, that it's actually helping your heart pump. So you're getting much closer also that these two things are getting pretty tightly linked together. So if your respiratory system's fatiguing, that might then directly affect the pumping of your heart. And it's hard to separate these things, right? Like where chicken and the egg, like what's causing what? But it's just interlinked, this cardiopulmonary system.
Stay tuned for part 3 of podcasts with Andre Feldman.